All right, welcome everybody to the Highland Park Public Library. My name's Natalie. I'm one of the Adult Services librarians here. We're thrilled to be working with Sustainable Highland Park to have Sue Tarr here to present native plants for everyone. And this is extra exciting because it's the first time that we are doing a hybrid program. So those of you on Zoom, can you hear me? And can you see the presentation? Okay, yes, okay, I see Tina nodding. All right. With that, I would like to welcome Chris Perez from Sustainable Highland Park, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight, Sue Tarr.
Hi, everyone on Zoom. Hi, everyone in person. Chris Perez, member of Sustainable Highland Park. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to the Highland Park Public Library for hosting this event. I'm really excited to welcome Sue Tarr here today. Sue is a Rutgers environmental steward and a master gardener volunteer. Sue has extensive knowledge of native plants and leads the native plant nursery at the Middlesex County Cooperative Extension Earth Center in Davidson's Mill Pond Park in South Brunswick. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sue Tarr, presenting native plants for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So, I've been gardening for a long time, 50 years plus, but it was only about 5 years ago, after I just put in a lot of gardens, that I really discovered that native plants were not just nice, but actually critical to our environment. I became familiar with some of the works of Doug Tallamy. If you haven't seen any of his books yet, he has these wonderful books on why we need native plants in our yards. Doug is a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware, and I've heard him speak several times, and he's a great speaker if you ever get the opportunity. But he has a couple of these books, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, very similar books, both talking about why we need native plants in our yards.
What is the name of the author again?
Doug Tallamy. Okay. And I'll put these books in the back so you can take a peek at them after I finish speaking. So let's go right on to the talk. What I want to talk about, okay, that's not, it was working a little while ago. It's not clicking.
Okay. Yeah, try now.
Ah, now it's clicking. Okay. So first thing I'll talk about is, the importance of native plants, and a lot of that information will have come from Doug Tallamy's books. Then I'm going to talk about what you can do in your own yard and how you can transform your yard to be, habitat and part of the ecosystem, as opposed to what many of our yards is a wasteland, right? And then we'll talk about selective native plants, some of my favorites. From perennials, I'll talk about mostly the wildflowers because they're easiest to get into your yard to begin with. And at that time, I'll talk about some of my experiences with these plants with our favorite animal, deer. And then I have some references at the end. Okay, let's begin with some definitions. So we're all on the same page. The USDA actually defines native plants, and they have this long, complicated definition here, which basically says, things that have historically been here in this particular ecosystem are native. And the way to think about it, the Native Plant Society of New Jersey simply says, anything's here before the European settlers arrived. So that's the simplest way to think of native plants. The next thing is alien species, or basically anything that's not native. And then the last thing is invasive species. So we have about 2,000 native plants in New Jersey, and most of the alien species, that you have in your yard, all those pretty things that are exotic and great looking, are pretty benign. They don't do any harm, but somewhere around 5 to 10% are invasive, and that is, they do harm. And they do harm because they escape your garden and displace native plants is the biggest issue. So, scientific nomenclature, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. When you're trying to buy plants and put them into your yard, you want to use and search for the scientific name. So there's a genus, a species, and then a cultivar. The genus, or genera is the plural of that, and species together define a specific plant. And it's very important because there's lots of plants that'll have the same common name. Think of larkspur. There's, plenty of those if you go into the garden center that are not native, but there is a native one, okay? So you've got to be careful when you're shopping. And then the last thing, the cultivar is a specific cultivated variety of the plant, so they've bred it for certain characteristics. So in this particular case, the Asclepias arcanata ice ballet turns out to be swamp milkweed. And ice ballet is a form that's white, whereas the native species is pink. So they're bred it to have white flowers instead of pink flowers. The problem with cultivars is they're clones. That is, every plant of a cultivar is identical. So if you're looking to have biodiversity and therefore sustainability in terms of the plant surviving as climate changes, you need the diverse genetics in the native species. And you don't get that because the cultivars are asexually produced and therefore all identical. Okay, so you really want to look, if you can, the species. Now, having said that, if you can't find anything but a cultivar is likely better than a non-native and certainly better than an invasive. So why natives? So plants are the foundation of the whole terrestrial ecosystem. That's pretty straightforward. Plants take the energy from the sun, and then basically most animals don't eat plants directly, but eat it through other animals, typically insects. The thing about that is that insects, 90% of all the insect herbivores are specialists. What does that mean? That means they're very fussy. They only eat certain genera of plants. And if those genera aren't around, the insect isn't around, and the animal that eats the insect all the way up the chain. So the whole thing falls apart. And what's happened is, if you think about plants, they don't want to be eaten, right? So they put up defenses, and it takes millions of years, really, for these relationships to develop where certain insects could eat certain plants. One of the most well-known examples is the monarch butterfly. People are familiar with that. It only eats milkweed. It's the only genera that it can eat. And due to loss of habitat, pesticides, et cetera, the populations have dropped 80% in the last 50 years. So we're losing monarch butterflies. But let's look at how it's adapted. So you see the picture here. And in this picture, I have a milkweed. That's a swamp milkweed. And we got the monarch caterpillar sitting here. So what did the swamp milkweed do to try to keep insects from eating it? First of all, it has this milky sap. And that milky sap is slightly toxic. Okay, so that's not good for most insects. Secondly, it gels the minute it hits the air. And what it literally does is gums up the mouth parts of insects so they can't eat. So they die. Now, what has the monarch caterpillar done? Well, it's got an enzyme that enables it to tolerate the toxicity of the milkweed. And what it actually does, this is really cool, when it nibbles on a leaf, if it can taste sap, it climbs up to the midrib, bites the midrib. When it bites the midrib, that stops the flow of sap to the rest of the leaf. And it happily goes down to the bottom and chews up. So it's got this very clever adaptation to be able to eat the milkweed. So now we know we need natives. Now the question is, well, how much do I really have to have in my yard? So there've been a couple of studies of Carolina chickadees. And admittedly, the picture there is a robin. That's the picture I found. So when you look at Carolina chickadees and look at all birds, 96% of birds feed their young on insects and basically caterpillars. Caterpillars are kind of a superfood. Think about them. They're big. Imagine if you had to feed baby birds aphids and how many you'd have to get at their mouth. They're nice and squishy. They don't have a very exoskeleton that's crunchy, so you can shove them in their mouths pretty easily. And it turns out the caterpillars are filled with all sorts of nutrients. So they're very helpful things. The Carolina chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed a nest of birds until they leave the nest. That's a lot of caterpillars. Then there was a second study that said, well, okay, so we know we need a lot of caterpillars. Well, how many native plants do you really have to have in your yard? And what they did is a study of a neighborhood, and they looked at the suburban yards, and they said, well, what's the biomass of natives? You know, basically the weight of the natives. So think of the weight of the leaves on the tree, plus the shrubs, plus the vines, plus the perennials. And they found out that unless you have 70% of your biomass is native, you can't sustain bird populations. They either produce no nest in those neighborhoods, or those areas where there were insufficient biomass, or they didn't produce enough eggs to basically keep the population going at its current size. So it's very important to have a fairly substantial amount of natives in your yard. That means you can have some plants that, you know, are favorites. I happen to love daffodils. They're not native, but, you know, I can have some natives, non-natives in my yard as long as they're not invasive, and that's not an invasive non-native. So now the question is, what natives do you want? So there's a very interesting website, and Doug Tallamy has had his hand in this, and it's by the National Wildlife Federation. And if you look at this website, you can sort of go two ways in it. You can find butterflies. If you find a butterfly, it'll say, well, which plants do you need? What are the host plants for that butterfly's caterpillar? Or you can go in the other way and say, you know, what caterpillars or butterflies does this plant support? And they break down, when you get to the plants, they do it by trees and shrubs. And then, you know, flowers and grasses. We'll look a little deeper here. So this is the caterpillar specialization, and this is Middlesex County. By the way, the nice thing about this site is you can plug in your zip code. So you can find out, you know, what's relevant to your area, not necessarily like, you know, pick a state, you know, Ohio. And if you look at this chart, what it's saying, you see this big tall bar with the number 1 under it. It's saying almost 700 caterpillars eat one genera. And then you can see it drops dramatically. So some eat a few more, but very few caterpillars can eat more than a handful of genera. And basically 75% of the caterpillars eat 5 or few host genera of plants. So that's pretty restrictive. Then let's look the other way. Oh, let me go back one. If you look the other way and say, okay, well, how many caterpillars can a given plant host? Turns out you can see there are a bunch here on the bottom that only host a few genera, a few species of caterpillar, but there's some up here you can see with more than 500. There are plants that will support, in general, that will support 500 different species of caterpillar. So let's look what they are. So we have, showing in my chart. Oh, there it is. It's okay, it's one behind. Oh, you're one behind me. Okay, I'll go back. So I just picked the first few here are the trees and shrubs, and those where you get the really big numbers. Quercus, and I'm very bad at pronunciation of scientific names, but that's close. That's oaks. So if you had to do one thing and plant one thing in your yard, the oak is the kind of the keystone plants. They call these keystone plants. It's the, you know, super best in terms of giving you a support for the most caterpillar species. Then down there you can see prunus. That's things like plums, cherries, that kind of family, that kind of genera. And then betula is the birches, and salix is the willows. And then there's more down in here. When you start getting to
Could you just repeat that again? Salix, betula,
willow,
salix, and betula is birch.
birch. And all these things, when you go to that website, they'll just keep going down, and there are many more that I didn't talk about. You can see when you get down to, I've given just the first 2 of the perennials and grasses from that database, but solidago, which is goldenrod, so we can see that's an extremely important flower to have in your yard. And then fragaria is the strawberries. So there's a wild strawberry. The strawberry most of us have in your yard is the non-native invasive one that's got yellow flowers. If you have one that looks like that, that's got white flowers, that's the native one. So let's look at another class of insects, because we talked about the caterpillars as being the big food source. But bees are the class of insects that pollinate most things. So 90% of plants are pollinated by animals, and that's mostly bees. Now, bees are specialists too, not as specialized as the caterpillars. About 25% of native bees are specialists, which means they only, can use certain kind of pollen. And we have about 100 of those in New Jersey. We'd look at the same kind of data. There's not as much study on this, but there's some data on this. We find that 70% of specialist bees have only one pollen source. And fortunately, if you look at the top plant genera for specialist bees, Solidago, again, goldenrod is the top one. So planting goldenrod not only helps the caterpillars, but helps the bees as well. So now we say we need all these insects, we need all these plants. We have native preserves, we have national parks, we have places where that native habitat exists. The problem is they're still too small and they're too isolated. So what happens when you have a relatively small population? The problem is there's natural population fluctuations, right? Depending on the weather, various populations of related plants and insects, the populations will go up and down. Well, if the population is small and it's in a downward spiral, it could wind up gone, right? So you need to have bigger areas. So the concept that Doug Tallermy talks about is biological corridors. You need ways for the plants and insects and animals to migrate from one area to the other. Given how built up we are, the only way we can really do this now is by taking advantage of where we live and work. So at home, what you need to do is start transforming your yard to be part of that biological corridor. You need to do your little part to create the biodiversity, create the native environment. And Doug has done a lot of work now about and calling this the homegrown national park. And you can register your property on that page and say, I've got, pick a number, 1,000 square feet that's dedicated to native plants. So the idea here is a grassroots effort to be able to say everybody does a little bit and we get ultimately a much bigger benefit. And the Homegrown National Park, if you Google that or search on that, you'll find there's a website and there's a ton of information there as well. So transforming your yard. So what do we have today? Somewhere along the line, big lawns became a big thing. And so we have lawns. They have high water requirements, high fertilizer requirements. Fertilizer pollutes our waterways. They're basically a wasteland in terms of value to the ecosystem. So that's a no-no. And I confess I've done the same thing years ago. You go into the garden center, you see that pretty exotic thing, you say, oh, I want that in my yard, right? Does nothing, looks pretty, but it really does nothing for the ecosystem. The one thing you'll find with the non-natives is they're pest-free. Okay, well, that's actually a bad thing. If they're completely pest-free, they're not contributing to the environment. So you have to share a little. So you have to expect your native plants to get chewed on a little. If they're not getting chewed on a little, well, then nobody's taking advantage of them. And overall, this whole, typical suburban yard today is very low value in the food web. So what do you want to do? You want to start having minimal lawn. I think initially I saw Doug say about 20% reduction. I think he's talking more like 50% lately. But the idea is you want to get rid of your lawn, and you want to put mostly native plants. The good thing about natives is you don't need to fertilize them. You don't need to water them except after that initial, except in the initial introduction period when you just planted them. And quite frankly, even last year, I planted several hundred natives in my yard, and I really didn't water except in one little area where it was a little dry, and they survived. So, they kind of like can handle it. And then you become these biological quarters into other native areas. So what do? First thing you got to do is you got to don't plant invasives. So you got to start learning what the invasives are. And if you've got invasives, remove them. I have to be a little judicial about that. I'll confess I have a non-native Norway maple, but it's 70 years old. And it's one of the biggest trees in my lot. Now you're kind of like in a quandary. It's providing a lot of carbon sequestration. It's, a beautiful tree. Do I cut it down? No. If I had 10 acres of land, yeah, I'd probably cut it down. But I only have a little less than a half acre, so I don't do that. So let's look on the invasive species again. The key thing on the invasives is the ones of the non-natives that become invasive have multiple ways to propagate themselves. So they propagate freely, and there's no competition because whatever keeps them under control in their native environment isn't in our environment here. They outcompete natives. They migrate from your yard. You say, well, that's not a problem in my yard, but it goes into the woods. And when it goes into the woods, it displaces all the natives. Again, because the natives are eaten by deer for one thing, but other insects and things that are native to the area. And these invasives, nobody touches them. So they just grow like crazy, and they develop into monoculture. So there's no biodiversity there, right? Just big field of various non-natives. I had a lot 25 years ago that was wooded, and I said, oh, this must all be native plants. And I now know they weren't, but I had Japanese honeysuckle, I had burning bush, I had the Japanese shrubs that were Japanese shrub honeysuckle, as well as the viney honeysuckle. I had privet, I had barberry, I had all these things that I assumed were native because they were in the woods. Answer is no. So to get information in New Jersey, there's a strike force. There's a website for that strike force. These are some of the widespread natives. So I had, as I said, I had the olive in my woods. I had some of the privets. I had the burning bush. Bradford pear I didn't have, but that's another bad one. The Japanese honeysuckle. And you can see there's a whole slew of things that are fairly common, and they still sell for the most part in garden centers. So that's one of the problems we haven't solved yet. Some of the states are beginning to move toward, restricting the sale of these invasive kind of species. So reducing the lawn. You want to start making incremental changes. Getting rid of lawn is not easy. I got a little aggressive the first time I tried this. My husband was like, you got to be kidding me. And the only thing that saved me was COVID, because I started this just before COVID hit. And then there was nothing to do but work in the garden, right? So I had plenty of time to do that. What I did is I took existing beds and I just made them a little wider, and I added natives. I made sure I had a hedgerow, that is a planting all along my property line between my house and the neighbors. So I had a couple places where there were vacancies. So I went and filled them in and made those beds. And then I had a big section of lawn in the front, and I put an island in. Okay, so you can do various ways to sort of progress, incrementally do it. The biggest problem is removing the grass. So one strategy I've tried is I leave the grass, take cardboard, take as big a piece as I can, because every time you put a seam, there's the possibility of something doing this. Put the cardboard down, put a 3-inch layer of mulch. Typically, I get the shredded bark mulch, and I make sure I get the stuff without the dye in it. I get something that doesn't bring any bad things in, and I let it sit. Do that in the spring, and then by the fall, I just plant through it, and that seems to work. If some of the weeds pop through, you can weed them easily because there's nothing else there, and it looks nice and neat, over the summer. The other thing you could do, and I've done this too, is dig it up. big chore. You got to get 2 or 3 inches deep, and it's just a lot of work. The best thing that happened is I had a section of lawn that was in good condition. My mailman came by, he was a master gardener. And he said, oh, my son just had a lot and they have nothing, they need some turf. He bought a sod cutter and he just took this section out and went whoop, 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 whoop. In an hour, he had removed all the grass and taken it away. So if you have a neighbor who wants some sod and you have good looking grass, that works too. But that's a little more challenging. The picture here happens to be Tiarella cordifolia. It's a lovely ground cover for the shade, semi-evergreen, has tiny little flowers above it in the spring. So planting natives. If you've been gardening, you know, there's all sorts of books about good garden design. Probably the most important principle is right plant, right place. So if the plant requires full sun, don't plant it in the shady corner of your garden. It's not going to survive. Those same things apply to both natives and non-natives. However, one thing you see in designs of gardens, you see this sea of mulch and then little islands of plants. What we're trying for is something very different, what I call green mulch. That is, instead of using the traditional shredded bark, whatever you want to use as mulch, you use plants to do purpose of mulch, which is basically to cover the ground. And your goal is to really cover it so nothing bad can grow up. You know, if you've got it covered with nice plants, you don't have to worry about weeds coming through. Take some time. If you're planting plants and you're saving money, you're probably planting small plants, which means there's, even if you put them at the right size for 2 years from now, there's going to be some gaps. So yes, the first year you probably want to put some regular mulch down. But after that, you should be able to, you know, let the plants fill in and let the mulches appear and plants go in. The other thing is, you know, if you don't have a yard, you still may have a deck or a patio where you can put some container plants. Now, if you go to Home Depot and get a basket for the summer, what you're going to get is a basket of non-native annuals. And what they will do is bloom throughout the summer. So if you're doing container gardening, you need to recognize that perennials won't bloom all summer. None of them will bloom all summer. They'll bloom for several weeks, depending on the plant. But you need to have a selection of plants, and you need to pay attention to when they bloom, so that you have plants that'll bloom in the spring, summer, and fall. You can plant them all in one container, or one strategy is to plant them in individual pots and then kind of rearrange them to highlight the one that's you know, flowering now. The other thing is they are perennials, which means they will come back next year. So you need to leave them outside because they want to be cold over the winter. Leave them out where they can get some rain and some snow. But you want to, you know, keep them in a protected area. I mean, don't put them in a corner that's going to get the northwest wind, right? Try to have them in somewhat protected area. And you'll need to be careful what you plant them in. If you plant them in a ceramic pot and leave the ceramic pot out, it's likely to have cracked by the spring. So what you want to do is either plant them in plastic pots or have plastic liners in the pots so you can pull them out of the pot, leave the plant outside, or put the fancy container inside. I have a picture here, and we'll talk about all these plants a little bit more, but each of these plants here, there's 6 plants. Those 6 plants would get you flower from the spring through the fall. And they're in order of when they flower. The Zizia, the Amsonia, and I can't see the next one in the picture here. Oh yeah, the Retibita, the Asclepias, the Solidago, and the Symphyotrichum aster. Okay, so again, that's some set of plants you could use for, you know, container gardening. So selected native plants. This is always a fun part, the picture of the plants. So I have in each of these charts a picture of the plant. I think all these pictures are from my garden. I have the common name, I have the scientific name, a little description of the flowers, when it blooms. It may not bloom May through June in terms of continual bloom. It'll bloom somewhere in that interval for several weeks. The height is 1.5 to 3 feet. And this one likes full sun to part shade. Some definitions.
I just want to say real fast, if you sign in the back, we can send out a PDF of the presentation, so you don't have to write everything down now. You can pay attention to what students say.
Thank you. Full sun, 6 or more hours. Part shade, 2 to 6 hours of sun. Shade, less than 2 hours of sun. So this plant says it's full sun to part shade, which means it can take all day sun to just as little as 2 hours of sun. Okay, moisture medium. I have medium, wet, dry. All the plants in this list will take medium. Some would like it a little wetter, some would like it a little drier, but they can all tolerate basically average soil. And I also comment that this particular plant is the host plant for the black swallowtail caterpillar. Then I have some symbols on the bottom, and there's 6 of them. And this particular plant, only 3 are relevant. It attracts bees, attracts butterflies. There are 2 that are missing that attracts birds, attracts hummingbirds. This is an important one, deer resistant, and the next one is rabbit resistant. I don't know much about rabbit resistance. This is, textbook from it on the rabbit resistance. I have a friendly fox who comes through my yard 3 times a day, and I don't really have any rabbits as a result. I've seen them make off with the baby rabbits. Deer resistance is a matter of degree, and what people will tell you is that, they don't touch it in my yard, and they eat it and demolish it in somebody else's yard. So different deer in different places have different tastes. This one in my yard, deer don't touch. I've never taken a bite out of it. It's flowering now. So much for May to June. It's a slightly early year this year. They're not in full flower yet. When they first start flowering, they're only about this high, but eventually they'll get to be about 3 feet high with the top foot and a half is really just the stalk for the flower. The other thing I like about this particular plant is if you cut off the flowers, it'll rebloom, light rebloom in the fall. One year, it was mild enough that that flower that was there in the fall was there to February. Then some deer got desperate. And the other thing is it's semi-evergreen. So it was green all winter. So that's a nice thing. I'm experimenting with this one as a ground cover. What I'm trying to do is plant a large area where I had this sort of green base of something that deer don't like. And then I'm interplanting in the middle of it things that deer like a little bit more. Okay, and trying to see if I can keep them out. And also it's performing my green mulch function. Okay. Eastern blue star. I happen to be a fan of blue. There are not many true blue flowers. It's an uncommon flower color. This is true blue. There's no purple tinge to this. It's very light. Doesn't bloom very long, but it's early. And it's a nice bushy plant and has a yellow colored leaf, so it's pretty in the fall too. Bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. Deer resistant. When I first had the little plant out, they nibbled it a little. Now that it's bigger and fuller, they don't touch it anymore. One of the things I do because of the deer problem is even on plants I know they don't like, if I'm planting a very tiny plant, a plug or a small plant. And by the way, those things actually do better. When you plant something small, it's easier to take hold and it transplants better and it saves you a lot of money. I always put some deer deterrent on it. I happen to use deer out because it doesn't smell as bad as some of the others. But I think any of them will do the job. And I usually try to, when it first goes out, just get the deer to condition that, yeah, I don't like that. Because if they just take a bite, just to taste it on a small plant, it's gone. Even if they spit it out, you're still out of plant. Penstemons. There are about a half dozen penstemons that are native to New Jersey. Deer do not touch these. This one I have all seven of my, I have 7 of them in my yard at this point. This one is Penstemon pallidus. It's the shortest one. But it comes out the earliest in my yard, and it is covered in these little white flowers. Deer have not touched it at all. The only problem I have is when I put in plugs, if the deer are running through the area, they kick out the plugs. They never eat them. So that's a great one for deer resistance. There's another one called foxglove beard tongue. This is a little showier, comes out a little later, it's a little taller. The flowers are bigger, but not quite as prolific, but still quite prolific. Quick question?
Yes, foxglove, isn't it a little bit dangerous for if you have kids?
Sorry again?
Foxglove digitalis, isn't that considered a little bit dangerous plant?
No, it's not the digitalis on the, there's some plants that are digitalis. And this is not that, but the digitalis is the genus, and those are the ones that are dangerous and not this. Now, having said that, if you go to the ASPCA Society and look at what things are, poisonous to cats and dogs, tons of things have some poisonous, and lots of common non-natives and natives. So you have to look, but most of the time the animals just don't eat it because they look at it. They don't like it for whatever reason. The thing about this one is it's got a very shiny leaf. And by the way, the penstemons tend to be semi-evergreen too. So they have this basal set of leaves, they shoot up these stalks, and you can cut them down after they flower. And what I'm experimenting with in these this year is seeing if I can make that a nice ground cover. So I ripped out some myrtle, which is non-native and approaching invasive. And I put these in, and I'm seeing if I can just cover the area, get the beautiful stalks in the spring, and then have just a green, mound, low mound for the rest of the year. Again, deer don't touch these. Asclepias tuberosa. This is my favorite milkweed. Butterfly weed. I think that's the one we have here tonight, if I heard somebody say. The thing I like about this one is it's small in terms of only being 2 feet in height. It's very compact. It's covered with flowers. If you cut the flowers off after they flower, you'll get a second bloom, later in the summer. The deer, when they were little, they nibbled them a little. Once they got to be bigger, they lost interest. So I think it's sometimes just the very tender leaves when they're very tiny, and once they get bigger, they don't touch them for the most part. If they do, it's a light nibble and they just go away. No big deal. Yellow coneflower. This one says deer resistant. My yard, it hasn't killed the plant, but I'm not getting many flowers in the front. In the back where I have a fence, they're beautiful. But they're kind of cool because these beautiful reflex petals, they're fairly high up, and there's sort of a bunch of leaves at the base, so you get these stalks up and they kind of wave in the wind. So they're very pretty. Oh yeah, I'm getting a noise here. Coneflowers, the common name coneflower applies to many different genera. Okay, so what most people think of as coneflower is Echinacea, and the common one is Echinacea purpurea. However, having said that, lots of other genera are called coneflower as well, which is why if you're shopping, you need to pay attention to the scientific name.
So also a lot of these, I'm wondering about color as you're showing these plants that are the perennials, the natives. No, not so many really extravagant colors, the bright reds. The butterfly weed is orange, but for instance, there are orange cone echinacea, purple echinacea, all those. Typically for this area, more the hybrids or something as opposed to the natives, or is that you can't make a general statement?
Well, there are red natives too. I just don't happen to have a lot of them in this particular talk. There's, for example, cardinal flower is a red native. It's not as easy to grow And it tends to be a short-lived perennial. So for somebody just starting out on native plant gardening, it's going to be frustrating when it disappears in a year or two. So that's one thing. There's a very pretty columbine. The native columbine is yellow and red. So that's another very pretty red flower. So there are red flowers. There's the bee balms. Those are red flowers. Okay. A lot of the ones in my front yard that are deer resistant happen to be yellow and blue and white and orange.
How do groundhogs consider this?
How do what?
Groundhogs,
Groundhogs?
yes.
I honestly don't have a groundhog to know. Another one that's strong on deer resistance is Agastache funiculum, Anis hyssop. It's a herb, got a very strong scent. Anything with a very strong scent is usually something deer don't like. So that's a good choice. So I don't have pictures here, but the mints, basically the deer shouldn't touch either. And there are a number of native mints. The problem with most of the native mints is they're quite aggressive. So just like the non-native mints, you know, you have to have a big space or pick one of the a couple of ones that are, you know, less aggressive. But it's a beautiful flower. It flowers for a long period of time. The deer didn't eat it, but they knocked over a branch. And so I cut it back and it flowered again. So, you know, you can get that kind of flowering out of it. So that's a very pretty one. Here's the purple coneflower. Says deer resistant. My deer eat it. I have it in the fenced-in area. So they're somewhat deer resistant, but my deer don't recognize that. And I don't get anywhere with them unless I put them, you know, in a fenced-in area. But they're spectacular. They grow quite large. In particular, there have been some studies on some of these coneflowers. Mount Cuba Center has done a lot of work with looking at, you know, what pollinators will go to what cultivars. Now, keep in mind, they're only looking at half the problem. They only look at whether pollinators go to the plants. They don't look at whether anybody eats the plant. You know, is it food for anything? But one of the problems is if you start getting the very fancy ones, you know, that are full and doubles, the pollinators can't figure out where the pollen is, right? So a lot of those things don't form an ecological function. So you've got to be careful with these things. The more the plant looks like the original, you know, maybe it's just shorter, right? The more likelihood is that it has an ecological function. You know, pick a plant that has like redder leaves or some different color leaf. Well, think about food you eat. You know, what if it's a different color? Well, probably doesn't taste quite the same. Well, maybe it doesn't, you know, appeal to the palate of the insects that need to be able to eat it. So you've got to be careful on the cultivars. Here's another one. This one I think is truly deer resistant. I put it in my yard last year. When it got to be about 2 feet tall, they decided to taste it. They nibbled a couple inches off. They said, ugh. Turned out that was very positive because the plant grows to 5 feet. When they nibbled a couple inches off, it only grew to 3 feet. It was a more compact plant, had more flowers. It was a great deal. The ones that they didn't prune for me were 5 feet and a little wild. Question?
When you put up a fence to protect against deer, how high?
Question is, how high do you need a fence to protect against deer? When I do, like in my front yard where I don't have the whole yard fenced in, I typically will fence in my shrubs, and I will typically use a 5-foot fence if the plant will grow substantially taller than that. I will use a 4-foot fence if the plant stays at like 3 feet tall. What I like to use is welded wire fence, and I find that works pretty well. I put it into the size circle I want. I take a couple of those zip ties and zip it up, and then I get the 12-inch ground staples, and put 3 or 4 of those in, you know, depending on the size of the fencing area, but that kind of holds it in the ground. And and I've done that up to maybe 4 feet in diameter, and it holds, but it doesn't have all those sticks that make it look, you know, very visible. And if you get the green coated, you know, kind of disappears. So that's what I do. Now, when I fence in the whole area, I find that my neighbor has a fence that's 6 feet high, that's solid, one of those plastic white solid things. The deer, I think, don't tend to jump over things they can't see to the other side. But I didn't want to do that, and I was just closing off the pieces that my neighbors didn't close off. And I took that, you know, black netting kind of stuff, and they could see through it. And I had it like 6 feet tall. Deer jumped it. So what did I do? What I've read is that if you put 2 fences, even as short as 4 feet high, 4 feet apart, the deer won't jump it. I've never tried that. But what I did do is back up my 6 foot one with a 4 foot one, 4 feet apart, and they don't jump it anymore. So what apparently is happening is deer have poor depth perception. As a result, they're not sure whether they can clear that second fence because they're not quite sure how far out it is. And there's some strategy that you might be able to get away with, you know, 4 foot high fence if you're willing to trade a double. It's also a strategy for getting things started. You might have a small area where you just want to put, you know, 4 feet section, and then maybe move the fence, get another 4 foot section. But again, it can be just this, you know, netting kind of fencing, inexpensive, easy to put up kind of thing. So those are strategies. This, by the way, is another, I'm a big fan of blue. This is another true blue one. There is no purple overtone to this one, which is why I like it. And it has that scent so that it keeps the deer away. Now, just another fun one. This is a common sneezeweed. It's just covered with these yellow flowers. It says 3 to 5 feet tall in my backyard. Okay, I'm not 100% sure this is super deer resistant. I've seen it in other places where they nibble it when it's small, but it does get big, heavy stalks. So I think if you can get it past the little stage, it won't be eaten, but it's just covered. I had 3 plants, planted them about 2 feet apart. At the end of the summer, I had 6 feet tall, absolutely covered with these flowers. They're about this big, a couple inches. Said you got to have a goldenrod. So here's one of the goldenrods. I have this in my back, so I don't know if the deer eat it, but I have another one in my front that they don't touch. This one I like in particular is it's well behaved. A lot of the goldenrods can be very aggressive and they can spread so they can overwhelm a spore garden. This one stays put for the most part. It's got beautiful arching stems, and it's got flowers along the stem. It's a very graceful plant. So that's a real big one. I remember we said, so the goldenrods are the ones that are really important for the bees and for the caterpillars. Another one I have in my yard, and this one's in the front. When it was little, they nibbled on it. Once it got a little bigger, they didn't touch it. This is a showy goldenrod. And big, covered in much bigger flowers than most goldenrods. So it's spectacular. Now a couple that are like important in the fall. Asters are also important in the fall because they, you know, a late food source. Deer touch them. There's no way around the deer eating them. They do eat them. I have some in my front yard. I've got them buffeted with, you know, things the deer don't like, and I get a few flowers. In the backyard, they're fenced in, they're covered. But the New England aster is one of my favorites. They says deep purple pink, but the fun thing is I planted maybe a half dozen to a dozen, and the colors vary from almost pink to almost purple and all sorts of shades in between. So it's really this sort of, you know, you look at it, it kind of feels like a Monet painting. You know, it's really very pretty. And I have it mixed in with this aster, which is called the heartleaf aster. And this one says it's blue, but it's really ice blue. So it's almost white. And so it really pops. So next to the other one, which is much darker, it creates this, again, that whole Monet effect for the painting. The thing that's fun about asters, you can see it very clearly in this picture. You see that some of the centers are yellow and some of the centers are purple. Once they've been pollinated, the centers change color. So that tells bees, don't bother with me, I'm done. And so, you know, the yellow ones, they come out yellow and they turn this blue color. And most of the asters do that. There's a white wood aster that goes pink, has white petals, yellow center, but the center goes pink once it's been pollinated. So they're fun for that reason. Another aster, I like this one. This is one of the ones that's smaller. Most of the asters get tall, and you can prune them to keep them under control. And in this particular, the aromatic aster, I did grow it from seed 2 years ago. I planted it in the ground, probably got to be plug size, little things. They were fully blooming 2-foot plants covered in flowers. They can get floppy. So what I do is I prune them on Memorial Day weekend pretty heavily. They come back and they stay shorter and more compact and are covered with blooms. So they're a good container one because they're well, they don't get out of hand. So that was kind of my list of some of my favorite wildflowers. Now, where do you get them? Getting native plants is not easy. If you've never been, you should go to Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. They have a nursery there. They open this coming weekend. They have 100 acres, fenced in, no deer. You should see what our woods would look like if you didn't have deer. Banks covered with wildflowers that you just don't see in our woods at all. So they're spectacular, and they have a good selection of native plants, modestly priced, fairly broad selection. The only problem with them is if you're looking for something specific, you just don't know if they have it until you get there and look at it. Another place that's local is Pinelands Direct. They have a lot of good trees and shrubs. A lot of them are like out of stock right at the moment, so you need to order them earlier. And sometimes they come in stock later in the spring, and they'll notify you when they come in stock. Question?
With the soils in Highland Park, sort of clayish with, slate or whatever, is all this going to work pretty well despite that?
I live in Princeton, and my soil is pretty much the same. But what I do is what you want is a lot of humus in your soil, organic matter. In my town, I live in Princeton. Princeton and Lawrenceville have an ecological facility. When they collect the leaves in the fall, they shred them. They compost them over the winter, and you get this like black gold kind of stuff. It's fabulous, and you can just pick it up for free. So, if you can find a source locally of that, that's the best. The other thing that I do is after I do the, really brand new bed, and I use that shredded bark mulch, not my favorite, but I use it. I use shredded leaves. So I shred the leaves in the front yard because it looks nice for the neighbors. In the backyards, I just pile the leaves on all my garden beds. And matter of fact, not shredding them is a better strategy because there's lots of insects that overwinter in that leaf litter. And if you shred it, you kill it. But since I collect my leaves from my neighbors' piles out front, and their garden and landscape people have already blown them to death with those leaf blowers, I figure most of the insects are gone anyway. So I shred those, and the ones in my yard I leave unshredded. But those are really good sources of enriching your soil. Another one, Pinelands Direct has a lot of trees and shrubs. I wanted to point that out. Toad Shade has a really good collection of plants, and these three are all ones I've purchased from, so I know what they supply. A little pricier than some of the others, but they have a very broad selection. They're typically, local one of the things you really like to do, if you can, is get local plants. Lots of plants will grow over the whole Northeast. Some will grow from, Georgia to Maine. And they talk a lot about ecotype, like specific to your area, because there may be slight variations that are tuned to the conditions here. So if you can get something that's local, it's better. Having said that, getting native plants is hard, period. So local if you can. If you can't, go further afield. When I do that, I've used Prairie Nursery. They have very good prices. They're small plants, but the prices are right. And you can get a lot of good stuff there. I use Prairie Moon for seed. I also like their website because they have a lot of seed. They sell some plants, but they're hard to find there. But they have a good selection. So you can select for native to New Jersey, full sun, yellow flowers in June, likes moist conditions, it's deer resistant, yada, yada, yada. So they have a very good selection criteria. So even if you don't buy them there, it's a helpful site to look at to be able to figure out what you might want. And then to be broader in New Jersey, the Native Plant Society of New Jersey lists where you can buy natives. It lists a whole slew of nurseries where natives are available. Some of them are retail, some of them are wholesale, and some of them, have natives and non-natives. Some of them are 100% native, so if you go to that nursery, you're going to get all native. Okay, last thing, just a couple of references. Why natives? The books again from Doug Talony and his Homegrown National Park website. And then books about native plants themselves. Where did I put that other book? This is one of the first books I had, Native Plants of the Northeast. So it's a fun book. I don't know, when I'm looking at plants, I like to look at the nice pictures, and they have them sorted by trees and shrubs and flowers and vines. And then I start, lusting after them. The other site, there are several sites. Missouri Botanical Garden, that says I'm supposed to be about done. The Missouri Botanical Garden, Plant Finder is a site that has natives and non-natives, but they have really good descriptions of plants. They tell you about the characteristics, where it'll say, and some of the things I said, full sun to part shade. It says, well, yes, it'll grow full sun to part shade, but it really prefers part shade, right? So what end it prefers. Oh, yes, it'll grow dry to wet. Medium to wet in terms of the soil, but it really prefers wet. So you have a better sense. Or the other thing it'll say is very aggressive. You got a small garden, don't plant it. So it's got that kind of information. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, wildflower.org, again, has a very broad listing of plants. You can also filter on that website. Doesn't have much information on them, but you can get lists. And you can start looking those plants up in other places. And then there are some lists on the Native Plant Society of New Jersey web pages as well. Okay, so you can figure out more about native plants. So that's what I had. The last picture of my deck is always the state flower of New Jersey, which is the common violet, which are up and blooming like crazy at this point. So questions, why don't we take a couple of questions? We already took them from the room. Do you have any questions from the remote audience?
Yeah, so someone asked, is there any particular variety of goldenrod that bees like, or are they all similar enough to make the bees happy?
I think they're all, I don't know of any one that they particularly like. I think goldenrods in general are very good. I don't have any specific detail below that. Question from the room. I think I saw a couple in the back over there. Yes?
Probably know the answer to this, but I always ask you just in case some genius has this. So I live right on the street, and bamboo is killing my garden everywhere. I read about it, but is there any experience getting, getting bulldozer?
Problem is, even a bulldozer, I mean, the roots go very deep. It's once somebody's planted it, you're in for a long haul trying to get rid of it. I have something in my second home, and when I had a second home in Maine, I had bamboo-like stuff, and I just kept pulling it and pulling it and pulling it, and it just never went away. So I think you're stuck
Okay.
with a lot of
I
pulling.
hope.
Another question in the back corner?
What are you using as like a ground cover tree mulch? 'Cause I didn't know if you said.
So the green mulch concept is plant the plants close together. So as opposed to, taking a plant that's 2 feet wide and taking 3 of them and planting them 4 feet apart, plant them 2 feet apart. So that's one way. The other way is, underplanting with certain things. Violets are wonderful. The deer will eat them a bit, but if you have enough of them, that's okay. I actually had, my husband hated it, but I had a section of my lawn that the violets took over. My husband eventually said, I got to kill them. Bad news. But then he couldn't get anything to grow, right? So, but the violets really will fill in and take over in terms of understory. I told you I'm using penstemon as green mulch because it can cover the space and you can use it as a ground cover.
What's the company for that one?
Beer tongue.
Okay.
Other things you can use like Phlox subulata. It's the moss phlox that you see in the garden centers now because it's flowering now. I have never been able to find the pure species, but there are lots of cultivars that are out there. But that's a nice low sunny thing. Another thing a little harder to grow is bearberry, not barberry. Bear as in, grizzly. It's a beautiful ground cover. It likes it a little sandier. So in my yard, I mixed in sand, but if you take sand and clay, you get kind of concrete. So you have to mix in a lot of humus to make it work. But it's a ground cover that's evergreen, has little white hanging flowers in the spring, and has red berries in the fall, but it's fussy. Once you get a patch going, it'll sustain itself, but you may wind up planting multiple plants to get there. The TRL cordifolia is a wonderful thing for the shade. It goes crazy. It's very pretty, but you can plant that under shrubs easily. That's another one. So, I mean, there's what you want to look for is things that are relatively low to use that. And, there was a talk by the Randy Echo, who's now the president of the Native Plant Society and also owns Toad Shade. And she's done talks, but, she'll take ground covers, to about 2 feet. So, you have to be creative and think about, what you really want to do there. And sedges and stuff like that will work too. So there's some short sedges. So there's some sedges and grasses that are very pretty.
So do those work as the same way lawn does, or do those work as flower beds?
I'm sorry, say again?
The ground cover you've been talking about, the green mulch,
Yeah.
does that work at the same way a lawn does, or the way a flower bed does? In that when they're not, when it's not in season, it's a bare flower bed?
The vast majority, yeah, okay. So the question is, when you have some of these ground covers, are they bare when they're not in flowering? Everything I described is green all summer. Some of them are green through the winter, but let's get real. Most of our lawns are pretty brown over the winter anyway. The only thing you have to watch out are things like spring ephemerals, which are basically a set of plants that grow in the spring and then disappear. Virginia bluebells is a beautiful blue flower, but it's got a big bush, gone. Trillium, they disappear. So there are lots of plants that will disappear, but be very pretty for what it winds up being a very short period of time. Question?
I see vinca everywhere. Is vinca invasive or native?
Vinca is it's not officially listed on the list yet, but it's approaching invasive. They will say it's okay if you can keep it in a confined space. If you let it grow into the woods, it'll take over. And I had a few pieces that when I transplanted stuff from my old house came with me, it's taking over. So I'm working to rip it out. But yes, I would not, it is definitely not native and I would not use it anymore. I would start ripping it out. I didn't take a question from this side of the room. Yeah.
Yeah, bearberry, what kind of soil do you mention likes? And
Bearberry likes sandier soil. So given that we've all got clay up here, you can mix some sand with clay The problem is if you just mix sand with clay, you get concrete. So what you want to do is you want to mix in a lot of humus, organic matter, compost, whatever. But if you do enough of that, you can make it work.
They planted next to blueberries.
Yes, it'd be fine next to blueberries because most of the native plants like it somewhat acidic anyway. A bearberry also, since it's also a shore plant, if it gets salt spray, it'll tolerate salt spray. Question over here? Oh, we have one from the.
Okay, another question from the Zoom audience. Do you have any do's or don'ts on selecting native plants to complement a vegetable garden, especially with tomatoes and herbs?
I don't have a native, I don't have enough sun to have vegetables, so I'm not an expert in that, but there are a lot of what we call companion plantings. So you should look up in vegetable gardens and companion plantings because there are plants that you interplant with vegetables that will help keep certain, pests away from your vegetables. I don't know them off the top of my head. Another question? Yes?
How do we know if the plant is native?
I'm sorry?
How do we know if the plant is native or not?
Still in here.
How do we know if a plant is native or not?
Well,
How do we determine?
Well, one of the ways to do it is to go to the USDA plant database, and they will list the natives for your state. Basically, they have a picture, a map of the United States. You can do that. I gotta stay near the microphone up here. The wildflower.org also has that. A lot of the plant sites will now list that, like Prairie Moon and Prairie Nursery will both tell you the range and show you what's native. Basically, they're replicating the USDA sites, but you sort of have to go into the various databases and start looking, right? And you've got to be careful in nurseries when they label it native. It could be native to California, which is not what you really want. It is a native plant, but not right here. So you've got to be a little careful about how they label the nurseries. Question.
Can you tell us a little bit about the native plant nursery at the Earth Center?
Yeah.
And your work there?
So what we did, we started it the summer before COVID. So our first seedling came up and Rutgers shut down. But basically what we did is we said, well, we want native plants and we want to be able to get them to the public. We want to be able to get them to nonprofits so they have some plants that they can get easily, and natives are hard to find. We wanted to create some demonstration gardens so that people could see what native plants look like in a more traditional garden setting, because a lot of the botanical gardens will have it in these vast areas that you can't understand how to relate to a yard. So what we discovered is, well, we didn't have a greenhouse. Discovered I don't need a greenhouse. What happens with native plants is, you think about it, what happens is most of the seeds come down in the fall. If those seeds were to germinate right away, they'd probably be killed off by the winter. So most of the seeds need what's called cold stratification. About 2/3 of native plants, if I look at some of these websites, about 2/3 of native plants require cold stratification. And what that means is they need a period of moist, cold weather, somewhere between 30 and 120 days. So what we did is we planted the seeds and we left them outside. We planted them in little 6-inch containers, about 2-inch deep, and we just left them. March, April, they sprout. Then we, take them from these little seedlings that are packed into these little boxes, and we put them in plugs trays, which are usually we usually get the ones that are about 50 plugs to a tray, which is about this big, and then we put them up into 4-inch pots. We have 2 sales, one in the spring, should be in early June, one in the fall, early September, and we sell at Rutgers Day. We'll be selling there on April 30th. And then last year, I think it was about 24 various organizations who came to us and said, can you help us out with some native plants? And they put in a request and they get them free. And biggest condition for getting them plants is, if you put the native plants in and you walk away, they're not likely to do well because they will get some weeds if you don't maintain them. So for the first 2 or 3 years, you really have to keep an eye on them and keep the weeds out. So that's the key thing we're looking for, is there a maintenance plan so that, you know, planting those plants won't go to waste. Another question back there?
Any comments on ticks and spotted lanternflies?
Ticks, don't worry about, like, they're there, like, live with it, right? If you have deer, you're gonna have ticks around. I don't find them in my yard. I had a wooded lot before, had a lot of ticks, but you know, more in our yard, I don't get many. Spotted lanternfly, they're a pain, but they seem to be dying out. In my yard, Princeton is one of the early areas that got spotted lanternfly in New Jersey. My husband found something online, and he literally takes an orange juice, a plastic orange juice can with one of those wide mouths. If you see a spotted lanternfly and you go like this, its instinct is to jump, and they jump right into the jar. Covers the jar up, lets it die. So that proved to be very effective for us. It kept the populations down, and we had substantially less spotted lanternfly last year than the prior year. And there's all sorts of sticky kinds of tapes and things you can do, but this one was easy.
As a follow through on the lanternfly, I think, I forget, as a high school student did a study of it. Its sensors are on the rear end, so when you bring the jar around to get it approach in front.
Or your foot.
But if it comes from behind, they are elusive.
Well, if they come from behind, they still jump back off the tree.
Off the tree. Okay, I'm thinking about things on the ground.
Yeah, but if they're vertical, you go like this, they go right in. Works well. Another question?
Yes, to buy the native plants, so what about the Rutgers Spring Flower Fair? Are they gonna have?
Say again, who?
Rutgers Spring Flower Fair. So that's at Rutgers Gardens, so.
Rutgers Garden has some native plants there. I don't work at Rutgers Garden, but they do have a mixture of natives and non-natives there. I've been to some of their sales before.
And then Rutgers Day, you can go.
Rutgers Day is on April 30th on the Cook campus, Douglas College Cook campus area. And we'll be there with native plants, and a lot of other people will be there with vegetables.
Will there be some native plants that you?
I'm sorry, April 20th was 30th last year. It's April 29th this year. Thank you. It's Saturday.
So will there be some of the plants that you showed, like goldenrod and like?
As a matter of fact, I have everything on that list in the nursery. The only question will be, are they up yet? For example, the Asclepias tuberosa is very late to come up in the spring. So on April 29th, they won't be up. And I think I'm out of last year's crop, so I just have the seedlings coming up in this year. So I probably won't have those. But most of the other ones I have from last year, and will be at the if the plants are up enough, we'll bring them to the fair.
So I think we have time for one more question, because then we have some seeds to plant. Do we have one more question?
Yes.
I live in a rented place and have a balcony only. Is there something I can do?
Yes, you can plant in the containers.
Okay.
And so the only real question is, do you have sun or shade, right? How much light do you really get? And if you have, a lot of light, pick one of the ones that says full sun. And if you don't have much light at all, pick some of the ones that say they can tolerate shadier. But they should work just fine. And the only thing, a caveat again, was plant them in a plastic pot or a plastic liner, because you should be able to overwinter them on your balcony. When the plants are done in the summer, they're all perennials. If you leave them on your balcony outside in the winter, they should come back in the spring. So somewhere around April, start watering them again. But they, our plants in our nursery, we don't water them. We stop watering. We turn off the water in the whole fields. We turn off the water at like the end of October, and we don't turn it on to April 1st. So the plants are on their own and do just fine.
Where is your nursery?
It's in Davidson Mill Pond Park. It's in, sometimes if people say it's South Brunswick, sometimes it's North Brunswick. It's 42 Riva Avenue. And if you actually search on any of the map apps for the park, it gets you to the right place.
So I also want to let everyone know, we sometimes have native plant seeds in our seed library here. I know Irene has donated some. We've had milkweed, sneezeweed, butterfly weed, some others. I don't know what's in there right now. But if you guys have these plants growing in your yard and you want to save the seeds and bring an envelope or a baggie of them here, we'll put them out in the seed library for your neighbors to take and try. Obviously, it's harder to start a plant from seed than to purchase it and put it in your garden. But if you want to try, or if you want to encourage other people to try, we'd love to have you bring the seeds in.
Keep in mind that 60% of them you can check, like Prairie Moon's website, they sell seed, will tell you whether it needs cold stratification. So plant it in your garden now won't do much good if it needs cold stratification. But there are about a third of the plants that don't need cold stratification. They bloom earlier in the year typically, so the plants can go to seed and can germinate right away and be okay.
And everything we put in the seed library, we put instructions, so take a picture of the instructions before you go home.
If you grab something now that needed full stratification, could you put it in your freezer or your fridge?
Refrigerator. So you put it in your refrigerator and just store it in a, dry for now. If you want to, it's a little late to do it now. Another few weeks earlier, you could have done it. You could have done cold stratification in your refrigerator. The problem is we're getting to the point now, if it requires any significant time, by the time it's ready to pull out, you're hitting the hot wave of the summer. I tried it last year late. It was a disaster. They just didn't make it.
So maybe only a 30-day is that.
If 30-day, yeah, you might be able to get away with it. If you get it done before June and the weather doesn't get too hot too fast, you might be okay. I'll be here while you're doing your next activity. So if you want to ask any questions, between activity steps here, I'll be here for the next half hour while you are.
Sue, thank you so much. That was so informative.
Well, I'll put these books out in the back for now. One of the
We
things,
also have books in the library. You can come ask you to put a hold on them.
yeah, you can take a look, peek at them and see if you want to put a hold on them. And there's a sheet at the back. Rutgers, through the extension, has a ton of different programs relating to plants, etc. And if you want to get on that mailing list, just sign up in the back. And I'll put these next to that mailing list.
Sign up to get the presentation.
That's actually the yellow sheet. The yellow sheet is for me.
The newsletter, we should sign up again. Okay.
This one is the one where this is when you get what
While I'm not out.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
Yeah.